Good morning. We're back from Mexico. We had a great trip down there. Got to see Abronia in the wild, which is what we were hoping for. And now we've come back. This is actually my backyard here in Middle Tennessee. It's late spring, and I wanted to take this opportunity to show you some of the animals that I keep in captivity. I've got a small collection of Abronia here. I've been keeping them for about 5 years, and I thought it'd be great just to show what I do to maintain these animals. There's a number of things that are important in their captive husbandry, and I wanted to pass that along to others because I think that's an important aspect of conservation of this species, is maintaining captive populations. So this is Abronia taeniata, and this is a female, and I've had this thing from a little tiny baby. And when I first was raising it, it had stripes, but it's now got a solid color. It's very bizarre. It's the only, I've got 6 taeniata. This is the only one that has this kind of coloration. I'm not sure why. I have seen taeniata in the wild, and they're extremely variable in color. They can look like 100 different animals. Even within a specific range, they'll be quite variable. But you can see she's got kind of interesting gray color. Usually it's more olive green. I think she's getting ready to shed. And Abronia, when they shed, it's just like taking a sock off. They pull that whole piece of skin off in one shed, just like a snake would. That's kind of unique to Abronia versus other lizards. Most lizards shed in different pieces, but Abronia, it's all one piece, comes right off. So she's getting ready to shed for sure. That's why the gray coloration on her skin there. She's not very friendly, so if I reach in and try and touch her, she's gonna kind of get aggressive. You can get a good view. She's out taking in some sun this morning. She's gonna warm up a little bit so she's ready to eat. She's one of my best eaters, so I actually have to be careful and not overfeed her because she'll put on too much weight. She's still at that stage. She's about 2.5 years old. She's at that stage where they're still growing and pretty active. Adults will slow down. They actually don't eat quite as much as the juveniles. Or don't eat as often anyway. Okay, now this is another taeniata. This is a male, and again, I've raised this guy up from a little baby. I had one pair of taeniata originally, and that pair, the female produced, had 7 babies, and this is one of the babies that is a male. He's about 23 months old now, almost 2 years. And this is more typical of their coloration. You can see he's got a lot of dark stripes and then alternating light stripes. They can be black and yellow. They can be kind of dark brown and beige, or they can be black and white. But usually there's some kind of a color pattern on taeniata. That's typical of this species. You can see here, this guy likes to use this cork bark piece. This is it's actually it's kind of a coconut husk piece of material. It's like a little board, a flexible board if you want to look at it that way. I use it in all my enclosures here, or at least in most of them. I use this slab of wood to generate shade. It's a barrier there, so when the sun comes out during the day, these guys have different areas they can crawl to in the enclosure where there's always a thermal gradient. There's shade, there's cool areas, there's warm areas. That's important to consider when you're doing, when you're setting up an enclosure for these animals. They need to be able to get out of the sun. So he likes to hide right there against the screen. I'm just gonna pull him out so you can get a better look at him. He's actually one of my better animals as far as temperament, so he won't even bite. He's pretty calm. There you go, you can see about how big this guy is. And I like this animal because he's got a lot of darker coloration on him. It's kind of an interesting looking. I don't know if you can get a shot of the head here. The head on a male is a little bit broader than it is on the female. So I had to separate him out. I had him in with another male about 2 weeks ago, and it was his brother. I had two males together. You're typically not supposed to do that, but I was trying it out, just kind of seeing how they would behave. And the other male, his brother, was chasing him around the enclosure, and there was also a female in that enclosure, so I think it was kind of a territorial issue. It's now, these guys are breeding age. He's old enough and large enough that he could breed. So I think he was being chased off for breeding rights, basically. But you can see that's a beautiful animal. Captive born, raised in captivity. Abronia taeniata. It's a really nice male. I'm going to go ahead and put this guy back in this cage. One of the things I do in these enclosures is I use a lot of tropical plants. I like especially bromeliads, orchids, and I like broadleaf. You got to use some broadleaf plants in each of the enclosures because it gives shade, and it's important that these animals have some cool spots and some warm spots they can go to during the day. Today, the temperature outside is about 70 degrees, basically room temperature. This is perfect. This is ideal for these animals. Where they come from, that provides a really good thermal gradient for them to climb in and out of. So they'll bask for a while, bring their body temperature up, and then they'll move around the cage. They'll find a spot that's, more comfortable for them. He's probably just kind of waiting for some food right now. If I was to offer him something to eat, he'd gobble it up right now, I think. All right, well, this is the male I was talking about. This is my favorite one. And I like him the best because he's got a lot of yellow coloration. And he's actually getting ready to shed right now, and I can tell that because he's got so much gray coloration. He typically does not have this much gray. But he's a very interesting animal. For whatever reason, when you keep these animals in captivity, they tend to lose some of that yellow. But this animal now is same age as his younger brother there. They actually are from the same litter. And so, 23 months old. Raised this guy from a little baby. But he's just got some spectacular coloration. Really interesting. So that is what you would see in the wild. Typically, you see a lot more yellow on these animals. And Abronia taeniata, quite variable, but spectacular animal. This guy here, you can see he's got kind of a broad head. See that depth or width on the head? That's typical of males. All right, so these are the taeniata adults, the male and female breeder that I originally started off with. And of course, they produce, so I got a number of babies that I've raised up, which are now also adults. So I'm hoping this year, this breeding season, we might have some success with F2s, captive generation, breeding on the babies. So we'll see what happens with that. They're certainly old enough to do that. It's kind of tricky getting permits to get animals out of Mexico. I was fortunate enough to have a friend who's a biologist, a professor out of a university in the Pacific Northwest, and he actually had permits and documentation to get these animals on a scientific permit. And so taeniata are pretty tough to get. It's not a very common species. I think it's less common than Abronia graminia, just my opinion. I don't have any proof on that or documentation, but I think they're less common. And then I also got my original breeders of the Abronia vasconcelosi, and those are animals that come from Guatemala originally. And I got those from a guy, from the same guy, the professor out there, and he got them from a guy in Canada. So who knows where they came from originally? Probably wild-caught animals, I'd have to guess. Okay, this is the last of the Taeniata group. So there's a male and 2 females in this enclosure here. And this is the female that I produced. It was a baby. The 2 brothers that we showed earlier, this is their sibling. So she's now breeding age. You can see her coloration is kind of the same as the first male, darker and lighter pattern. Again, they use their tail to hold on, just makes them feel more comfortable. So you can see if she's wrapped around my finger there. Nice looking female. You can see her head is not quite as broad. And the other thing you look at on gender, males have a little bit of what they call a Hemi penal bulge right at the base of the tail. It's very slight, it's hard to see. But females, their tail is just basic cylindrical. It's circular, very round right at the base. Anyway, I've gotten to the point now where I can quickly look at an animal and tell if it's male or female when they're adults. When they're juveniles or babies, that's a different thing. But this is just a really pretty female here. I'm going to put her back. She'll probably just crawl around a little bit. And then you can see up in the back of the cage, I don't know if you're able to zoom in on those. The female on the back was her mom. That's the mother there. She had the 7 babies about 2 years ago. And then this is the male in the very back. One of the important aspects of keeping Abronia in captivity is providing them with a thermal gradient. That means you've got to have areas that are hot, areas that are cool, areas that are moist, areas that are dry. So you accomplish that, and you can see in this enclosure here, you accomplish that by giving shade. You have some areas that are full exposed to sun, and some areas where they can get away from the sun. For example, this enclosure here would never work for Abronia if it was just a bunch of sticks and there was no shade or no cover. Because you can see up above me is the sun. The sun would just beat down on these guys and make them too hot all day, and that would not be good for the animal. The animal has to be able to move in to the cooler areas and move out of the hot areas when it wants to. It chooses its own temperature range. And so what I've done in this enclosure, and I want you to kind of zoom in on the plants and the moss, you'll see that there's a lot of different little niche areas in here that the animals can get to so they can cool down. So one of the things I use to accomplish that, this here is just a piece of, what is this thing? It's coconut tree bark that's been put together in a it's basically a slab, and they use this. This is something I think T-Rex produces this, and I just buy the 10-gallon size, and I think it's $5. Nice little piece of wood would do the same thing, but I kind of like this because they can climb around on it. It's coconut husk, is what they call it. But you can see I just position that to the side. That way the sun doesn't beat down constantly in that particular area of the cage. They can crawl down in these little cracks. I've also got a slab right here of cork bark. You can see that kind of at an angle. And underneath the cork bark, if I move this little, here's an orchid plant. This thing is like 3 years old now. But you can see I've got all kinds of sticks in here. But you can see this moss. That's the sphagnum moss that I was talking about. That's so critical. That's such an important part of the enclosure because this is actually moist. You can feel the temperature difference. Just like in the wild when you could feel the bromeliads are a little bit cooler in the bromeliad, this acts like a bromeliad for captivity. All right, they'll still use bromeliads in captivity, but I've just found this moss is a great substrate to use in their enclosure. And I pile it up. That pile there's probably 6 inches deep. It's like a mound. And that acts to protect the animals because on a hot day they'll climb right under that stuff and they'll use that to keep cool. So it's a great part of the environment. The other thing you'll notice, all the branches and sticks that I've got lined up in here, they've got a lot of texture. So this is something that's not, You don't want to use a bunch of slick like manzanita. That's not a very good branch to use because it's got no texture. But this way they can climb and hang on to that. You can even see that female is just perched right up there on the branch. They'll also climb all over the screen, but that just gives you some ideas on setting up the environment. And of course I've got lots of broadleaf. This is a little pothos vine. I've got lots of broadleaf plants in there, and those grow in the environment as well, and there's lots of shade, lots of niche habitat in there that these guys can crawl around and use. So this is actually an ideal setup. You can see the screen here. The screen allows the sun, the natural sun comes right through. They're basking in natural sunlight. That's what's best for them. All right, this is Abronia graminia. So it's kind of shifting species. We first talked about Taeniata, but this is my favorite male, and you can see he's got some yellow around his eyes, his beautiful green coloration, and he's about, I'm going to guess, about 2.5 years old. Again, I raised this guy from a little tiny baby. We actually, me and a friend, Roberto, he and I have a breeding project in Mexico that we've set up in cooperation with the government there. And we got permits and all the legal documentation to import a small number of Abronia graminia every year. So we captive breed them there, then we're able to export them out of Mexico. And we're trying to establish a good sized colony of these animals here in the US, and I've shipped some of them over to Europe. But we're trying to set up a breeding group in captivity that's viable to protect this species. And I'd like to do the same thing with a couple of the other species, but it takes some time to get that paperwork and those permits processed through Mexico. They have certain steps you have to go through. Most people aren't aware of the permit process and don't know it exists, and if they were, they don't have a contact there that speaks fluent Spanish or is interested in this project, so that's why there's nobody else doing this. Just takes a lot of effort to make that happen. But this is something we're really excited about. These animals, of course, are very rare in the wild, so it's especially important to keep them in captivity and be able to reproduce them, I think. For one, it's going to eliminate kind of the demand. I will say there is some demand in the black market for smuggling these animals out, and that's unfortunate. But there's not a lot you can do about that. Whenever there's a rare animal that people want, there's going to be a group of people that'll smuggle them out. So what we're trying to do is supply some of that demand with captive-born animals that are legal, that have documentation. We think that's a better way to get animals into the hands of breeders and institutions that want to work with them. So this animal, I'll try and get a little different angle, but he's really skittish. I don't really handle my animals all that much, so I almost never hold this guy. So as soon as I reach in there, he's probably going to bite me, but we'll see. See if we can get a closer look at him. And you can see about how big he is. He's a good-sized male. You won't see many graminia more spectacular than this animal. This is a really fantastic looking male. He doesn't like me holding him, so I'm just going to put him back. I just wanted you to get a close-up of his head there. It's a nice detail. Abronia graminia. One of my favorites. This is Abronia vasconcelosi, and this is my favorite species that I keep, and probably my favorite species overall of the Abronia. This is a female that I've had now for 5 years. This particular female has not bred, and I don't know why that is. It's kind kind of frustrating. But you can see this is a little different looking animal than the other two that we've got. It's got auricular spines, is what they call them right here. You can see they've got the little spines there on the head. That's one of the defining characteristics on this particular species. And really beautiful pattern. I like the markings that you see around on the head there. This animal is about 6 or 7 years old. I'm not sure exactly how old it is, but I got it as a mostly full-grown adult. But I've had this animal for about 5 years. Just a really beautiful lizard. This one is a little bit lighter colored than most of the animals I've got. There's a male up here that I'll pull out in a second so you can get a shot of him. He's got a little more green coloration on him. These guys get a little bit larger than Graminia or Taeniata. They're probably 25% bigger. They weigh more, they bite harder. I haven't been bit too many times, but all right, I'm gonna grab this male, see if I can get him down. Yeah, he wants to bite me. There's the male. See, he's opening his mouth in a threat display. He's ready to bite. Not many animals better looking than that thing. That's a really beautiful male vasconcelosi. These are from Guatemala. All the other animals we've looked at are Mexican species. This is a Guatemalan form from the highland regions of Guatemala, right around Chichicastenango. That's where they're originally from. Very rare in captivity, also very rare in the wild. We don't see a lot of these ever, so it's hard just to find pictures of them. So it's great to get some footage. I'm really excited to be working with this species. This is the species that I've kept now and bred successfully for the longest period of time. I've got some babies here that I'll show you in a minute that were born about 2 weeks ago. And they are what we call F3, which means that they're a third generation captive born animal. So I had parents that had babies. I kept the babies. The babies grew up to adults, and those produced babies. And my parents, I know, were captive born as well. So all that means is we're doing a good job of breeding this species in captivity, which is great. This guy looks like he wants to bite me. That's why he's got his mouth open. But you can see from his coloration there and the pattern, that's a beautiful animal. Definitely something that want to keep healthy and do well with these guys. I'm going to put them back in there. This is female vasconcelosi. This is kind of my prize female breeder, really. She's produced 2 litters, and she's working on a third. If you can kind of tell from looking at the other species that we looked at, she's heavy. She's definitely gravid, and in fact, one of her daughters, a 3-year-old female, had babies 2 weeks ago. So we'll go look at the babies in just a minute. But you can see that's what a female looks like when it's gravid. Very big, it's like the size of a football. But if I get a hold of her here, you can kind of see how heavy and round she is. Look at that. She's just thick. And she's been out basking the last few days, trying to get some sun. They tend to do that. They bask quite a bit before they have the babies. And I don't know if you can tell, she's got these jowls puffed out. That's typical of right before they had the babies for whatever reason. This is a mature female though, about 6 years old. She's been, like I said, she's been my best breeder on this species. This is my biggest male. Definitely a proven breeder, very strong animal. You can see he's got the spines right there on the corners. And he's giving me the warning there that if I keep messing around with him, he's gonna bite me. So I won't mess around with him anymore. I don't like getting bit by this guy. He's pretty tough. But this is a male vasconcelosi. If I were to hold up a Taeniata or a graminia right next to this guy, you'd see the size difference, but this is quite a bit bigger animal. From Guatemala, that's where they're from. So you can see the way I've got this cage set up. I have a large broadleaf plant here that provides plenty of shade. Lots of sticks that go up into the top of the cage. The sticks make a good basking spot. That's where the sun hits. And I've even got bromeliads down here on the bottom. I've got a little cork bark rather. They're positioned in the back so that there's shade. There's always shade in this cage, no matter what time of the day it is. So that's perfect for these guys because they can climb in and out of the sun and the shade as they want to. This cage here is about 3 feet tall, about 2 foot square. So that's an ideal size for a pair of adults. And I have found you don't want to keep 2 males together. It's a bad idea. The males will fight. You can see this male here, he's pretty feisty just with me poking at him. If there's another male in there, he's going to get real aggressive. They'd become extremely territorial. And they'll fight and do damage to each other, so it's not a good idea to keep males together. This guy is obviously used to being fed by hand. I can feed him with tongs or by hand. He was kind of more interested in showing me threat display than eating right there, but I just kind of poked a bug in his mouth. These are, what are these? Waxworms. Waxworms are a good little supplemental animal. I use mostly crickets, but I prefer to use grasshoppers, roaches. There's all kinds of food sources you can put into a captive husbandry routine here. Must not be too crazy about waxworms. And that's kind of typical of adults. They're not super aggressive feeders. They have a low metabolism. I think they have a really long lifespan. I know Vasconcelosi was at the Dallas-Fort Worth Zoo. They had a captive record there of 12 years. And they got the animal as an adult, so who knows how old it was, but they do live for a long time. These are animals that have pretty good long lifespan. Probably 12-15 years is, I would say that's on the lower side of what they probably are in the wild. I've had this animal here for going on 6 years, so we know at least they live that long. And he's still very much an active breeder, so I would imagine that they can breed well into their, late years. The last female that we looked at, that Vasconcelosi, was one of my breeder females, and she had babies a couple weeks ago. And these are the babies that I've kept. I've got 2 in this enclosure, 2 here, and 3 here. You have to keep them kind of separated. They don't do well all together. I think they get real aggressive towards each other, and so they need their space. But just so you get an idea how small these guys are when they're first born, Here's one right here. I can't really even pick them up. I have to let them kind of crawl on me. They're just so small. There we go. That's what a baby looks like. They are live bearing. That's a baby vasconcelosi there. It's 2 weeks old. When they were born, they were actually just a little bit smaller than this. They've already grown some. But you can see that's a really small animal. And over the years, keeping these guys in captivity, I've tried all kinds of different things. I've found that the best way to keep them is just the same way you keep adults. They need the thermal gradient. They benefit from the natural sunlight. They need smaller prey items, obviously, so they've got little tiny crickets in there. I like to use the 2-week-old crickets because they've got a little bit of size on them. And they'll take phoenix worms, these little worms that I buy. They're soldier fly larvae. But you can see that's just a delicate little lizard. Actually, it looks delicate from the size, but it's pretty hardy, pretty strong little animal. As long as you keep them and raise them just like you keep the adults, they'll do great. This last clutch of Taeniata babies that I raised, I didn't lose a single one. So, and that's what we like. We like to not lose any. So I'm just going to put him back in here. I thought I would talk a little bit right now about climate and controlling the temperature gradients for Abronia, because that's a big deal. In the wild where they come from, high elevation, they have pretty wide swings between nighttime temperatures and daytime temperatures, as you can imagine. And when the sun's out during the middle of the day, it might be quite hot, let's say 85 as a high. It doesn't usually get over 90. In fact, almost never gets over 90 where these animals are from. And in fact, in the way I keep them outdoors here, if it gets over 86, that's my personal point where I say I'm bringing everything in and I take everything inside. But I like to keep them outside as much as possible. For me here in Tennessee, that's about 6 months a year. And I think that's critical to their success, both from getting natural sunlight and also the temperature swings, because the males will become more fertile if they have that drop in temperature, particularly in the winter. So that's something I think plays a role. I can't prove that, I just know that from experience. I've kept animals, I've talked to other people who've kept animals where they keep them indoors year-round and they have no success with breeding them. But in keeping these animals outside, I wanted to point out, number one, I bring them back indoors in the winter, and then number two, when it gets really hot in the summer, I bring them indoors. I've got a climate-controlled car garage here, it's third car garage, and we have it insulated, and I've got a heater and AC unit connected to that, so I make sure I manage the temperatures pretty well with that system. But the other thing I do here, and you might be able to see along the bottom of these cages are all set directly on a platform of cement. This is a patio. That patio maintains a certain temperature gradient. It's actually cooler. If I were to lift this cage off and take a temperature reading there, it's about 10 or 15 degrees cooler underneath these cages than it would be out here, for example, say where the sun is hitting. So that's an important aspect of this because it gives the lizards a cool place to go to when it is 85 degrees outside. They've got the shade, plus they got the cool gradient on the flooring of the cage. So those are just some things I wanted to point out and make sure that you had that information. I think in the grand scheme of things, these are critical elements of the husbandry, and especially if you're trying to breed the animals, I think they're points that can't be ignored. I will make one other point, and that is I study the climates from Puebla, Mexico, from Orizaba, from Chichicastenango, all these areas where I know Abronia are found. I have them bookmarked on a website. So for me, it's MSN Weather, and I check, and every day I see those temperatures, the highs, the lows, and the precipitation. So I know what my thermal gradient should be. I know about where the hot is and where the cool is, and I try to stay within those tolerances, even keeping my animals, whether it's indoors or outdoors. And so I'll just leave it at that. I wanted to make sure that we covered that topic in some detail because I think it's an important one. Well, we've reached the end of a journey here, a journey of exploration that started in Mexico and ended here in my backyard in Middle Tennessee. I want to thank you for joining me. I hope it was as fun for you as it was for me. If nothing else, at least we got a good education out of this experience. I do look forward to maybe in the future going back to Mexico and potentially Guatemala as well to explore the highlands, because there's a lot of other species of Abronia that I'd like to see and film in the wild. So until next time, as they say in Spanish, hasta la vista, or the one I prefer, que Dios les bendiga y saludos. All of this dedication and effort that I put into reptiles, more than anything, takes a lot of time. And time is a limited commodity for sure in all of our lives. And when it comes to my life, I get the most support and encouragement from one person, and that's my wife. And she's very, very thoughtful of the fact that I do put a lot of time into this, and I appreciate her for that. And she's helped me on so many levels, everything from feeding and watering our large lizard collection that lives on the side of our house. We have a third-car garage that's been completely insulated and climate controlled just to take care of the animals. And she also volunteers to watch the boys. We have 2 young sons, so while I'm off on another lizard safari, she'll watch the boys for days at a time by herself, and it's just, believe me, that's a challenge in itself. And she'll even get involved in the planning and strategy of some of my reptile endeavors. She gives her input on how I should proceed with some aspect of captive care or working with the Mexican government to advance our efforts with Abronia. She's always been a willing participant and a source of strength. And most women wouldn't put up with stray bugs in the house like escaped feeder crickets or cockroaches, let alone have a colony of live lizards living around the house, but she has, and I appreciate her kindness and support of my lifelong passion for study of reptiles.